Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local.
But so my item to sort of close out today is kind of a little bit fluffy but interesting. There are a number of former Google employees who were terminated for allegedly leaking confidential information. They were activists. They were internal employees who were outspoken about certain things that Google was doing with I guess immigration authorities, or was contemplating doing. And they're suing Google for several things, among them for violating the pledge to not be evil. And their contention is that this, which was part of the code of conduct up till a certain point, became a contractual term because employees sign employment agreements incorporating the code of conduct. And so they were acting in accordance with the don't be evil mantra and the imperative to alert Google when it's being evil, and they say that they were fired for that behavior. And there's more going on in the lawsuit, but that was kind of interesting to me. And it's a pretty far-fetched claim, that piece of it, the contractual claim, but it's interesting to me on many levels. So I don't know if you guys
great clickbait.
Yes, it worked on me. Well, I mean, I think what it represents, right, and this is part of a larger discussion, it represents sort of the early idealism of companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter and others who held themselves out as new kinds of companies that were embracing a certain kind of perspective or value set. And what has happened as they've matured, as you were just discussing, David, is that you get a lot of pressure just to make money and to maximize the value of the company, to improve the market cap or to maximize revenue. And so there's this tension between these original values and what these companies have become, which is mature, really mature, huge capitalist engines. And their employees and people in the world are still kind of adhering to the old values, or many people are, and feel that, the move toward more monetization is a betrayal, and all the things like working with the DoD or the Customs and Border Protection or whatever it is. And so that's I think that's
my response to that is that it's a naive holding of an old ideal, and that capitalism is a very tough taskmaster. If one company is generating super profits, for example, with AI and the Department of Defense, and Google's not there, then capital is going to flow to that other company. And capital flows dictate, at least amongst the larger companies, maybe not amongst really small companies, what VCs call lifestyle companies, right? These are companies that put the value of the employee or the value of the customer as high as the value of profit. But in most larger companies, there is one master, and that master has to be served. Otherwise, capital will flow in the other direction. And so from where I sit, it's interesting that Google is finally being called out. It's interesting that their reputation is finally taking some hits here. But as I pointed out in the past, it shouldn't be a company du jour. It shouldn't be this month it's Google, last month it was Amazon, 2 years ago it was Walmart, and before that it was Microsoft. The reality is that this is an issue with the way capitalism and stock markets work. If you don't like it, change those things, but don't, otherwise the rest of this is just sort of naive thinking from my point of view.
David, do you want to add anything
there's a lot to unpack there. I would say I generally agree with the implied advice that Mike gave. If this kind of corporate ethics is really important to you, you should probably go to work for a smaller startup with more control over its own financial destiny and more influence over its policies and who it does business with.
Well, are we just to sort of throw up our hands and say, oh, the whole system is corrupt by definition and there's nothing to be done, and pass the preferred intoxicant, party like it's 1999 or whatever?
I think it depends a little bit on your point of view. If you believe that capitalism is reformable with appropriate governmental regulation, then government provides a chance in the form of a more aggressive FTC or Department of Justice to bring some of the worst excesses in line. But that's a big question, whether or not government is independent of capital or totally intertwined with capital. And so, but if you believe that that's the case, then your outlet is, working with the government to increase regulation to remove some of the excesses, the abusive excesses of these companies.
Well, I'm not quite as.
I agree with that. I think that I was going to say, I think you have to fight capitalism with capitalism. I don't think we're overturning the system anytime soon. And that, yes, if you have a strong regulatory arm at the government that is preventing monopolies from happening, theoretically, with good journalism, and, I guess in this case, this is sort of more PR than actual journalism, but you can start to, consumers will if they have a choice, they will start to move to better players. And I think we're starting to see that. We're at the very early stages of what I hope we're starting to see, with consumers actually having an alternative to buy from local businesses instead of Amazon, with things like Shopify, even with things like the Walmart distribution network that we've covered in previous Near Memos. And so I think if you do have consumer choice, if you have government regulation, appropriate government regulation of these essentially monopolies, that consumers will eventually vote with their dollars for issues that they really care about.
Well, I mean, I tend to be sort of less cynical about the system, perhaps, but I also believe that consumers will do the right thing if that's easy for them and if they're given the opportunity to, right? And I think, this is a long conversation in itself, and I think we're almost out of time. But I do think that people in Gen Z especially care. Millennials, not as much. The older you get, the less people care about these social concerns in their purchase and behavior. But Gen Z does care, and there are ESG funds out there. BlackRock, one of the biggest hedge funds in the world, is trying to direct some of its investing toward more socially responsible things. And climate change dictates that we change how we do things in the world. And so I do think these values matter, and I think that the companies that declare them should be held to them. I think this particular lawsuit is probably destined to fail. It may succeed on some California labor code violation grounds, but it's not going to succeed probably on the don't be evil conceptual contract term. But I do think these things are important, and I don't think companies should hold out these values and then just treat them as, sort of the ethics washing or whatever the equivalent would be. Just pretending like, oh, yes, we can say these words, and they really ultimately don't mean anything, but we want to use them to attract people who take them seriously. So,
yeah, that's right.
Go ahead. No.
That's you said it better than I would.
I don't know. The one counterweight that I would add to this, if you want to see how markets get created and controlled through the government being sort of intertwined with capital, watch Dope Sick on Hulu. A great example of how a market literally was created around pain relief that spoke to profit, not people, and how the FDA and largely the legal system was co-opted by that, as well as all these institutes that studied pain. So it just shows you how that mechanism works at a meta level. And it is problematic, and it is bigger than just consumers deciding, because this.
Well, they don't have complete. Yeah.
They don't have complete choice, right? The doctor says you need OxyContin. Right. So Dope Sick, I thought, was a greatly done, really well done view of how this works, how regulation works, or doesn't.
I just started it. I haven't really gotten deeply into it, but I will on it and unless David, you want to make another comment on this point. I will say, apropos of nothing, that a much happier documentary or show is the Beatles Get Back on Disney Plus, which is at once tedious and totally amazing. If you haven't seen it, it's really well worth seeing if you can stand the 8 hours of footage. But it's really just a remarkable thing if you're at all a Beatles fan, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So. We'll be back next week to talk about more TV and movies,
And the local search ranking factors.
And the local search ranking factors with special guest Darren Shaw. It'll be a dedicated episode, and we'll explore that in detail. So have a good week, everybody.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.